Hi there, welcome to or welcome back to Jeffrey's Books, or your books I talk to you about them. I'm trying a slightly different space today, and I thought we would do a little bit of a wrap up. We're just going to talk about my highs and lows. I have my laptop here so I can tell you what I read because I don't remember. I'm just going to start off with some brief numbers for you. I finished this month 19 books, and that was 2,800 something pages and 61-ish hours of audio. This is audio-wise really down for me from last month, and I didn't realize that until like the end of the month. I thought I was actually like, oh, my physical reading is really suffering, but my audio reading is on track. My audio reading in January was 131 hours. So everything is down for me. It's just been a rough month for me. And so you'll see that reflected in the things that we talk about. My average time to finish a book this month was 5 days, and considering the shortness of a lot of the things that I read, that's a lot. So, moods from Storygraph. Most of the books that I read were dark, adventurous, and tense. This is pretty normal for me. Majority of the books that I read were under 300 pages, which is actually kind of abnormal for me. I'm normally right in the middle. 300 to 600 pages is my normal. Majority of my audiobooks were 8 to 16 hours, which is pretty standard for me. So majority of what I read was horror, and that is because of the manga that I read. I read 3 volumes of Attack on Titan and 4 volumes of Chainsaw Man. So that's 7 volumes of manga. That's where a good chunk of my page count comes from as well. So we're not going to really go into detail on those. So my overall stats for the month for ratings wise was an average of 4.11, which is pretty good. Nothing I read was below a 3. So I did have the 2 books that I paused, and one of them may turn into a DNF, and that was The Murmuring of Bones. I just was not invested in the story, and I don't know if that's because of the audio narrator or it's because of the story itself. The other one was The Spirit Bares Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White, and that one, the audio narrator really wasn't working for me. He was doing kind of a lot of like whisper talking, and that tends to cause me like physical discomfort, and I wasn't finding myself enjoying it. I didn't want to pick it up. I didn't want to keep reading it. So I did pick up the physical book because I was really interested in the story itself. So I picked up the physical book from the library, and I'll be continuing it that way. But beyond that, everything I read, I rated a 3 or up. So I do have a few 5 stars now that I've gone back and done the ratings. I do want to list first my nonfiction, which I've given it all a 5 because I think it's all valid and worth reading. I don't know how to rate poetry, so I just gave it 5s because I really enjoyed it. So the 2 poetry books I read are Night Sky with Exit Wounds by Ocean Vuong, which I really enjoyed and I think is really worth giving a read, and Sister Tongue by Farnaz Fatemi, and I really liked that one as well. Both of them talk about their experiences. Fatemi is an Iranian American and Vuong is a Vietnamese American, so both of them bring their ethnicity and their family history into their poems, and both of them are queer as well and bring that into their poetry. And in Fatemi's case, there's a bit of her life in kind of like a memoir type in paragraphs that are very lyrical and explain like her getting in touch with her roots and experiencing Iran for the first time as an adult after coming a couple of times as a child, and really just kind of gives like a window into her life as an Iranian American who her family came right before the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And then Ocean Vuong talks a bit about his history with his family and how the Vietnamese War affected them and that type of stuff. So very interesting, and I really enjoyed reading their perspectives. Ocean Vuong is fairly close to my age. I believe he's like a year younger, we're a year older, and there was just so much millennial coded angst in it, and having that from including the like other perspectives of his identities was really interesting to see. Some of my own emotions mirrored and reflected in different ways, and I identified with some of the melancholy and depression coded bits of it. But I did have a novel that was a 3.5, and I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. It's just my low of the month, and that is Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. And I read this on audio, and I think the audio is a very fascinating listen. I really think there's nothing wrong with the book. It's extremely literary and fantastical, and kind of serves as a bit of a memoir with some fantastical elements, and I really think it's worth a listen. So Tagaq is an Inuk throat singer. So she does traditional throat singing, and I was listening to this at a really fast speed because she narrates the book herself and she speaks kind of slowly. So I was listening to it like 2.5, and the throat singing at the end, I would not recommend listening to it at that speed because the throat singing does not sound like throat singing when you speed it up to 2.5 times the speed that they are normally doing it at. And so when she throat sings, it sounds like horror movie sound effects. So I would recommend listening to at least the end of the novel, like the end of each chapter, at a slower speed, or just being prepared for what you're going to go into. And having that in there is really fascinating and kind of adds into the emotion and the context of the story. It didn't hit me as hard as I would have liked it to, because it was a very different style of book. Like I said, there is nothing wrong about the book. This is just a subjective review of my enjoyment of it. Is kind of what brought it down. But I find the book to be fascinating, and I would like to sit down with a physical copy and maybe reread it again to see what I can get out of it. So I do recommend it. Okay, so let's talk about my highs of the month. I told you about the 2 poetry collections. I'm going to tell you about the 1 nonfiction. So I read Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumez, and she wrote this book. It came out in 2020, I believe, and it's kind of the subtext for it, or the subtitle for it, because it's Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And it is absolutely fascinating and talks basically about how evangelicalism rose up in the United States starting in like the 40s and the 50s in the beginning of the book, and then we go through to the modern current era. And it is absolutely fascinating how white men have completely commandeered this religion and changed it to reflect what they want it to reflect. It's fascinating beyond that. I really recommend reading it. If you grew up in it but weren't, so like I grew up in it but not like fully submersed, because my parents were weird about liking the church, but I grew up with a lot of these teachings, but not in the churches themselves. So having the context of why I was getting taught that, my parents loved televangelists. I spent so many nights having to go into my mom's room at 10 o'clock after my siblings were asleep, because I was the oldest, and I had to sit and listen to Creflo Dollar and Jesse Duplantis, maybe? I'll see if I can double check that name. I had to listen to them with my mom every night, and if I did that, I didn't have to go to church on the weekends. And church was held in our living room by a friend of my mother. So I had a weird experience, but having this context for it was really fascinating. And I did go to a couple of youth groups in the early 2000s when you had things like Mark Driscoll, and him kind of, he's kind of like the hipster of Christian evangelicalism. And so we had some of that kind of like tone to stuff where it's very interesting. It's really hard to explain in a very short time. But if you're interested in it, I recommend it. If you were not raised in this, it will give you some context for what is happening right now and who is getting involved in American politics. If you were raised in it but didn't have the bigger picture, it helps give you the bigger picture. And it's absolutely fascinating. If you don't want to read it, there's like a few episodes of Fundy Fridays you could watch. The one on Anita Bryant is good, and ties into this. The one on Mark Driscoll is good. Most of them are good. I haven't found one that isn't. But in the context of this book, those two relate directly. There's also a podcast called In God We Lust that explains what happened with Jerry Falwell Jr. And the second episode of that ties in a lot to this book. And then there is a 2-part episode of Behind the Bastards, which is Andrew Tate and the Mythopoetic Men's Movement. And the Mythopoetic Men's Movement kind of ties in a little bit to this like Promise Keepers movement from the 90s. It's kind of like adjacent to it, but it gives you like a little bit of context for how these things can like overlap each other. So definitely worth the read. Those things are worth listening to. I have a nonfiction spreadsheet that I'll put in the comments, and one of the tabs on the spreadsheet is like supplemental watching or reading that I recommend. Some of the things that I just have on my list that ties in, and other things that I have watched that I believe tie in very well to some of the different nonfiction books. I have not read every nonfiction on this. This is kind of my nonfiction TBR, as well as some books that I've read that I've just been gathering information. So I'll put the link for that in my description. Okay, my one 5-star this month, and I went back and forth on whether it should be a 5-star or not. But I think it should, because it just really stuck with me, and I cried. I told one of my friends, I was like, I wasn't sure if I was gonna give it 5, but then I almost cried like 5 times. So 1 star for each time I tried to not cry in traffic. So, and that is I keep my exoskeletons to myself. I'm Marissa Mack Crane. So when I was looking up information on the author, it said they are non-binary. I like to make sure that I use the correct pronouns if I can find the information. So they are a non-binary author and also identify as a lesbian as well. And so this book is written from kind of that type of perspective. The main character is not non-binary, but she is a lesbian, and her wife dies in the beginning of the book, and she's left to raise their child all alone. And their child is punished at birth for the death of our main character, Chris, of her wife. And that's because in this world, if you commit a crime or hurt someone, you get a second shadow so that you can be identified in public. They've done away with jails, but everyone has this other shadow, so they can be identified and shunned in public, and they slowly get more and more of their rights taken away. Everybody is under this surveillance state where cameras have been installed in people's homes, and Chris's wife dies in childbirth, and that makes the state assign a second shadow to this newborn baby, which is something that has never happened before. And Chris on her own has to raise this baby while grieving. And so it's kind of literary in that aspect of like her learning how to deal with this. The baby is called the kid or the baby through 90% of the book. We don't learn her name. And that is really fascinating. And she's just kind of watching this kid grow up in this environment of surveillance and autocracy and authoritarianism, and how that is shaping the kid's existence of her having this extra shadow from birth, not knowing her second mother, having this kind of split family, having a mother who's suffering from grief through the entirety of her young childhood. And then Chris eventually does meet someone else and bringing her in, and then like watching other people who have these shadows and how their lives develop, and it brings kind of in the queer experience into this authoritarian dystopian nightmare of a book. And overall it was just like really, really well done. It was really emotional in the right ways. I think it talked a lot about things that metaphorically fit things that have happened before. Reach with Rachel did a video the other day where she was like talking about decentering The Handmaid's Tale when you're talking about dystopian stuff. And I recently had a post on Threads get too much traction, and it broke containment and ended up with like a bunch of really hateful comments on it. But in the beginning, a lot of the comments were, it was basically me being like, I had this small stress spiral recently, and my boyfriend didn't realize like how much I was like stressing about it. And then when I brought it up to him, he was like, oh my God, that could be an actual concern. And a lot of women in the comments were like, oh, you should make him watch The Handmaid's Tale so he can understand it. And I was like getting really frustrated, because I was like, I haven't even watched The Handmaid's Tale. I am not stressed about this because I saw it in The Handmaid's Tale. I'm stressed about this because I have seen what has happened to women under other authoritarian regimes. And all you have to do is look at the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the beaches before it versus the beaches after it. Like, you can see what happened to women's rights. You can see I'm gonna spiral on here. Anyway, so she did this video about it, and I think when you decenter, I agree that you shouldn't just be switching to one book. One book is not the epitome of everybody's experience under an authoritarian regime. Having different voices, especially diverse voices, so that you can have this intersectional discussion about dystopian nightmares is worth having. And I think adding this book into that, if you're making a new like vocabulary of dystopian literature, adding this one into the lexicon is like a really good idea, because it is giving you the queer experience of it. So I loved it. I really think it's worth giving it a read. It's not sci-fi totally. It is literary, but it's a literary sci-fi. So it's dystopian. It's a dystopian novel. So anyway, that is the highs and lows of what I read in February. It's now March 1st. So let me know what your thoughts on these are if you've read them. Hopefully this wasn't too chaotic. It feels really chaotic right now. So if it doesn't feel chaotic, it'll be editing. And let me know what the best and worst book you read in February was. And I'll see you soon with something else.